Good evening. Welcome to Agents of Change, African American Professionals in the Intelligence Community Reflect. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, our panel discussion will be moderated by two ambassadors from our collaborative partner in Network. They are Jace Nath, the furthest away from me, but not from my heart. He is in Network's head of engagements, and he is also their legal expert. Closer to me is Dahlia Reed, a former diplomat and current student at Liberty University. These two moderators will be posing a series of questions to Ambassador Marcia S. Bernicat, 32nd Director General of the Foreign Service, in the middle, and Spy Museum Advisory Board member Colonel Fleming, Tal Sullivan, United States Army Special Forces officer, next to Dahlia. He can be the rose between the thorns, right there, just in that one moment. And Brigadier General Francis X. Frank Taylor, former Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Intelligence and Analysis. Very impressive. Enough from me. Over to you, Dahlia and Jace.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction. As per Amanda's introduction, we're joined by a panel of three brilliant and distinguished individuals who will be sharing their expertise with us. Each panelist has a wealth of experience which can help dispel misinformation and provide clarity to our viewers. Today's program will touch upon 4 key points: career journeys, impacts, representation, and lessons that we can take with us. Dahlia, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you so much. And we are so delighted to be moderating this panel and interviewing you all. But before we go into the details of your career, I'd like to ask something a little lighter. Starting with you, Ambassador Bernicat, what was a faux pas that you had committed earlier in your career that you look back on and laugh at today?
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Dahlia, for starting us out that way. So, okay. Joined the Foreign Service. My very first assignment was to Bamako, Mali. And we were given training for soup to nuts, including especially protocol. And I was told that the new ambassador going to Mali was having his farewell party. He was leaving as the director for West African Affairs, and that I could attend the party and meet him there. And I knocked on the door. He answered it, and I thrust out my hand, looked him in the eye, and I said, "Wonderful to meet you, Mr. Ambassador." He winced. I thought, what did I do wrong? And he said, "Call me Parker." So protocol out the window. I can still laugh at it. I'm still in touch with him. He was my first boss in the Foreign Service. But today I laugh. That day I was horrified.
Mm-hmm. And then you, Colonel?
There's so many. But early on, I would say now every now and again I dabble with cigars, but early on in my career I did not, never had one before. So my first experience was that at my basic course down at Fort Moore, Georgia, as an infantry officer, and having a dining in function. A lot of cigars passed around, celebrating the evening, and never had one before, and watching, looking, seeing how everybody's doing the cigar and holding it up proper, and holding the stogie, and didn't know at the time you weren't supposed to inhale a cigar. So there I am with my dress blues and looking the part, and I'm steadily inhaling, and I'm trying to maintain my best composure as possible as I turn green and start to gag. And a friend of mine looked over and saw me and said, "Are you inhaling that?" I said, aren't you supposed to?" He just shook his head and started laughing and said, "No, you're not." So if you're ever dabbling cigars, definitely don't inhale. So that was my first faux pas.
Duly noted. And you, General?
Well, like the colonel, so many. But the thing that really steps out to me was I was a intern in the State Department in the EUR-GER in 1969. And I worked for a Foreign Service officer, Elwood Williams III. It was absolutely the worst experience I had ever had, and I swore that I would never again set foot in the State Department. 30 years later, I became the ambassador for counterterrorism. So never say never. You never know where your roads will lead, but that turned out to be the beginning of a long national security career.
That's wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for sharing those recollections with us. So this question is posed to all three of you as well. I want us to begin by demystifying the field for our audience. So starting with you, Ambassador Bernicat, and then moving to you, Brigadier General, and then to the Colonel, what is a common misconception that people have about working in foreign service, intelligence, or in foreign policy?
I would say there are a couple of things. First of all, in spite of our best efforts and mediocre to really exciting efforts in popular media and television, we tend to be a really well-kept secret. If I meet someone and they ask me, what do you do? Well, I just retired, but before I retired, I'd say I work for the State Department. And inevitably, the person would say, which state? And I'd say, all of them. We cover everyone. So one misconception. The other one, and I really want to emphasize this to your audience, is that in order to be hired to be a diplomat, that you must have a background in history, international relations, government. A percentage of us have those backgrounds, but we actually hire people from every background. We're looking for diverse backgrounds in no small part because diplomacy isn't limited to international relations and government affairs. I don't know that that was ever the case, but even more so in these times. In addition to the traditional diplomatic service, we have 19 specialties in the Foreign Service. Everyone from an accountant. When I joined, they used to let history majors do the books. Bad idea. Speaking as a history major. All the way to doctors and psychiatrists and building maintenance engineers and, of course, IT and diplomatic security, which the ambassador was also the head of. So I think, if you're thinking about a career in international relations, pretty much anything you can think of that you want to do, you can do within that context.
Thank you. General?
Wow. That's a tough question because people have perceptions of the military. They have perceptions of the State Department. Maybe have never met a Foreign Service officer or a military officer. I think the biggest misconception is that all the people do in the military is order each other around. That there is no free thinking, no innovation, and energy that people can put into how they approach their job. We're not so structured that everything has to go top to bottom, right to left every time. But and it came to me when I went to GE as their chief security officer, and I got this lecture about, well, you can't order people around. And I said, huh? The perception was general officers coming into the private sector would be ordering, not creating consensus and all those sorts of things. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions of our military and indeed our government, that all we do is follow orders. We do follow orders. That's important. But there is a lot of innovation and opportunity to use your skills in many ways as you serve.
Thank you. And you, Colonel?
Yeah, very much agree with General Taylor. The misconception is the military, and more specifically, even in the Army, it's this monolithic, draconian organization that doesn't inspire free thinking, and it's all about orders and formations and marching around and hut, hut, hut. when in fact, what separates us from the rest of the world, our military, is that we inspire innovative thought. We seek it. We seek innovation. We seek initiative from our service members. And I can speak specifically of soldiers in our Army, and that is we want that independent thought. We want innovation. We want initiative. I know that, having been at a Ranger school, and there's that last part of the Ranger Creed, in order to complete the mission, though I be the lone survivor, Rangers lead the way. And the concept behind that is for soldiers to understand the mission, or service members to understand the mission. What's that end state? What's the intent? And then when all things fall apart, that individual is armed with that objective. And if they be the lone survivor, they can carry that mission out. So that's what separates us from the rest of the militaries of the world, is that we crave that, we look for that, we seek those individual service members to think for themselves. Yes, follow orders. There's a structure there. There's good order and discipline. But at the end of the day, we want that initiative we want our soldiers or service members to take that initiative to accomplish our missions.
Thank you. Very enlightening. And Brigadier General, this question is for you. National security is often seen as a high pressure and high stakes field. How did you develop resilience and adaptability throughout your career?
Well, we want to keep that rumor so that people think we're special, right? Building a career is about building on your experiences. And with broader experiences, different experiences, you become confident in who you are over time. Yes, it's a high pressure environment. You're making tough decisions. You're doing things that matter to national security, but it's who you are, who you become, that really steadies you during those tough times and the good times, that all that experience you've built, all the training you've gone through, just as the Colonel was saying, accomplish the mission. And I think that's the nature of how we grow, not only our current leaders, but how we grow our future leaders. It's through experiences. It's through doing things you never thought you would be able to do, or someone asking you to do something that you felt you couldn't do, and you somehow got it done and gained some more confidence to move forward. So I think it's a series of experiences over my career that have made me comfortable in doing what I do, or what I did and continue to do.
I believe this next question kind of follows a bit into that, but more focuses on what could make you uncomfortable. So, Colonel, we often hold to personal convictions, be they religious, cultural, ethical. Were you ever met with any challenges or any missions that tested the boundaries of your personal convictions? And if so, how did you deal with them?
Great question, and a rather sobering one. In my field in the Army, started out as an infantry officer, and then transitioned over to Special Forces, where I spent the preponderance of my career. And obviously, after 9/11, 2/3 of my career was spent in combat. The personal challenge to my belief system was the employment of as I say, judicious use of violence, all right, the taking of human lives. Many of us are taught, thou shalt not kill. And whatever our religious beliefs or background, there's a common thread throughout all religions or belief systems. In war, that's a requirement. There's an enemy that's seeking to do the same to us. Going in wide open, understanding what that requirement is and what those challenges present, and then engaging in that willingly and knowingly was a big challenge for me. How do I deal with that, or how have I dealt with that? Prayerful reflection, but a thorough understanding of, at the time, what was required. and what essentially I signed up for. And that was the job at the time, and that was required, and that's what happens on the battlefield. And what we can do as professionals in that line of work is understand and apply as judiciously as possible before we execute that. And then we all individually have to deal with those consequences in the end.
Thank you.
This question's for each of you now. How did you manage to affect change in your respective careers, whether in foreign policy or institutional culture or international relations? Starting with you, Colonel.
You're on a roll.
All right. Show up every day. Show up every day, being a master at your craft. And again, going back to kind of the early on faux pas, we're not going to be perfect. We're not going to know all the answers right away, but we show up with a willingness to learn, and we demonstrate what we do know in front of our peers, superiors, our colleagues, and that sets a tone. And as you build on that, you start to implement change, and you're seen for the value that you bring every day as a professional. And people will see that in you as well. Your eagerness to learn, your willingness to learn, the background, your professionalism, what you know. And when people see you demonstrate that, immediately they start to want to invest in you. All right. They come back and they say, I think I see something in that person there. Let me engage with them. Let me talk with them, and maybe build their knowledge base a little bit more. Some of us may refer to that as mentoring, right, or being provided a mentor. But showing up to work every day, demonstrating your craft, your level of knowledge from the very beginning is how you go about day to day.
Ambassador?
Building on everything that you said, I would add that there are two mistakes I think you can make early on in your career. One is that you don't think you have enough experience or seniority or status to actually make a change, when in fact, you're coming into the organization and you may see things that don't make sense to you. I always urge our newest hires to speak out. At a minimum, ask the question. That can lead people to actually stop and think differently than they have been thinking. Someone who's been in an organization a long time knows what the rhythm is, knows what the conventional answers are, but those answers can change over time, and fresh eyes, fresh perspective can make a difference. The other thing that I think early on in your career that is essential, particularly in diplomacy, is that every success that a president or a secretary of state achieves is built on the relationships that people are making, both back in Washington, but especially out in the field. You may be a junior officer issuing visas, but if you're rude to the applicants, that has a way of trickling back into the host government, as opposed to if there's good, efficient, friendly service, even when you have to say no, it builds a different kind of attitude that it reflects on the entire embassy. As I became more senior, I quickly realized, and I started saying this to my teams, that if I'm the smartest person in the room, we're in trouble. Not because I don't have some good ideas, and the more experience you have, the more I think you're naturally able to contribute. But first of all, a leader who takes on the burden of having to have every good idea is going to, in my opinion, fail, if for no other reason than they're missing the keys. I give a quick example. When I was in Senegal, I was the ambassador, and I'd been sent to post with two directives from the assistant secretary. One is try and preserve democracy. The president at the time was eroding the democratic process. And secondly, to fight corruption. And my team and I, the American officers all thought, well, we could do this or we could do that. I went to speak to our senior local employee, political analyst, and I went to his office and I said, what do you think? He came up with the strategy that we used that was exceedingly successful. One, he had the background that we did not have. Two, he saw an inroad by challenging the president, or actually offering to help the president make sure that his anti-corruption commission was actually prosecuting cases. It was a brilliant strategy. It built a partnership, and it made a difference. So take advantage of that team around you to make sure you're getting the best out of everyone.
In general.
Those are tough examples to follow. You know, I think for me, the moment for me of being sure about change was when I became a general officer to command the organization I had spent 30 years in, and to go from being a member of the group to being in charge meant not that my perspective changed, but leadership of an organization that you've been a part of all your life. You can just do it the way you've done it for all your life, or you can shape that organization to meet the new challenges. And for us, Khobar Towers had happened in Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War, and our agents were being challenged significantly in terms of their work and whether their work was consistent with what the Air Force needed. It was, but we weren't telling that story well enough to our senior leadership and senior leadership of the Air Force. And we made some adjustments that were not popular in my organization in terms of outreach to our Air Force, outreach to our Air Force leadership to explain how we worked. Not what we did, but how we did it and why we did it a certain way. And 20 years later, that initiative has sustained us as an organization within our Air Force as we continue to grow and meet the new mission needs that our Air Force has for us. So it's the courage to see a need, to change culture, to make that culture more viable to your customers so that your customers better understand and support you, which is what happened in my organization.
Very good. And that actually falls perfectly into this next question on change. General, how did you balance maintaining status quos while pushing for change when change can be so radically different from existent norms?
It's another great question, but you know the challenge of leadership is as the colonel mentioned, getting the mission done. And if you're continuing to do what you've always done and it's not working, then you're not getting the mission done. And so the responsibility of leadership is to ensure that the organization has prepared itself to meet the mission as it is today, not as it was 30 years ago when I joined the organization. The mission was fundamentally different. So leadership is about change. It's about recognizing that not only your institution gets a voice, but the enemy gets a voice too. And the enemy doesn't necessarily see it the same way you do. And if you don't adjust, you're not successful. And it gets back to the colonel's discussion about mission. Because if we don't accomplish our mission, we're failing to the people that have charged us to do certain activities. And that's the most important thing for all of us, and to do it well and to do it consistently.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for those really insightful responses. I believe that our next question also does connect back to this concept of change or adaptation, modifying the way that you do things so that it can address the new issues that come across the different ages. So this question is directed to all three of you, but I'd like to begin with the ambassador first. Throughout your careers, how have you been able to drive meaningful change, whether in policy, institutional culture, or in international relations?
Throughout my career. Hmm. That's not the question I thought you were going to ask. So let me start with uh, my last job as Director General, which is actually the head of all personnel for Foreign Service, Civil Service, our largest workforce, our locally employed staff, and family members, and by extension, contractors who also work for state. And we were driven, by the time I became Director General in May of 22, we were coming out of the COVID era. And I can't think of anything, I can think of two things in the course of my career that drove more change in general than, or required us to change more than anything else. I'm old enough to have joined the Foreign Service during the Cold War. It was the end of the Cold War. And as we were coming out of the Cold War, there was a lot of talk about the peace dividend. Where were we going to spend all that money that had been dedicated to countering the Soviet Union and its allies to better manage world affairs? The peace dividend didn't last very long, I should say. The war on terror overtook it fairly quickly, but it caused everyone to stop. All of us who had joined the service, had joined the State Department, were so focused on that singular conflict that we really had to pull back and think, all right, what do we do now? How do we use this luxury of time and resources in other ways? Going back to the COVID example, and this has been the case throughout the working world, we realized, and State Department had, for many reasons, resisted the ideas of remote work and telework. Most of us work with classified or sensitive information, and we didn't see how it would be possible to do that. Well, when remotely, when a life-threatening disease that we knew virtually nothing about, including how to stop it, was upon us, suddenly everyone was ordered to work from home except for a few essential personnel. And about 6 or 8 months into that process, we actually looked at maybe we need to have a more purposeful way in which we determine who gets to work remotely and why, and how do we also work that to our advantage. Are there certain professions, particularly ones that are difficult to compete for, like in the IT sector, where we could offer as one of the incentives working remotely? Well, without going into all the details, we developed a number of different approaches to remote work that not only allowed people to work off-site, but also allowed us to make sure that tandem couples who both worked for the government could remain together and both working while one was deployed overseas. Or if you were married to a military member, how you could go overseas and continue to work by doing your work remotely. But a whole series of changes were born not from the fact that we suddenly thought, oh, we can do telework, but no, telework was foisted upon us. And so we figured out how to make that work to our advantage. That's being rethought. It is being rethought in the entire working world. But I would say change, to sum up the answer to your question, oftentimes change is thrust upon us, or we must find another way to get the mission done when the conventional ways that we know how to do things don't work. Sometimes we impose the change.
Right. Thank you. Colonel?
Oh, great. I would say gaining trust and confidence and building consensus. I was thinking back to 2014, 2015 timeframe. I commanded a task force in Lebanon, in Beirut, Lebanon. And one thing throughout my career in special operations, I always prided myself on, in every command billet or leadership position I had, I would always try to tell my colleagues, subordinates, it's about thinking differently, okay? How do we do things differently? We've been given these wide parameters, staying within those parameters, but how do we get outside of the conventional wisdom or the conventional thought of doing things? We're wide open. Let's think about it. So No kidding, there I was in 2014, 2015, Beirut, Lebanon. And Beirut, Lebanon or just Lebanon, the country in general, is one of the most complex countries on the face of the earth in terms of political dynamic, cultural, religious, ethnic. And I commanded a task force and spent about a year there. And there were some kind of steady state things. Yeah, there's a threat from Hezbollah. There's, which is an Iranian proxy. There's just a lot of disparate activities going on in the country that there's been a lid kept on top of it for decades. And I kind of fell in on that. About 3 days after I arrived, if you remember 2013 timeframe, 2014, there was the rise of ISIS. And ISIS was active. And if you remember the ISIS methodology in their establishment of the caliphate, it stretched all the way from Iran, Iraq, and going across to Syria. And oh yeah, by the way, it ended right on the coast of the Mediterranean in Lebanon. So at the time, 3 days into my tour, there was an ISIS threat of incursion across the border from Syria into Lebanon, which no one saw coming. And immediately it was, okay, this is not the status quo. What needs to happen here? At the time, it was State Department, DoD policy not to give Lebanon ISR, unmanned aerial systems, because of the threat of Hezbollah. And we understood that and the reasons why. However, with this threat of ISIS coming across the border, it was necessary that we the USG, the U.S. government, had some type of fidelity on what was potentially coming across the border, and we didn't have that. The Lebanese Special Operations Forces at the time were doing a great job trying to repel that threat. Our Special Operations Task Force, given the limited authorities that we have, were supporting them, but we weren't actively engaged in that. But identifying the need to have some kind of fidelity, some kind of intelligence gathering along the border there, the unmanned aerial system was something that was necessary. I worked very closely with the chief of station there, with the ambassador and the country team, all building a consensus, all for the right reasons. We then presented that to the National Security Council. And in a couple of months' time, which is actually a pretty quick turnaround for for our government, we're getting State Department, getting Department of Defense, getting the intelligence community all on the same sheet of music, identifying the need, allowed Lebanon to purchase 2 commercial off-the-shelf ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms that we would benefit from most of all, just to ensure that U.S. forces in the country and in the region were protected, that we had some kind of intelligence to be able to prevent certain strikes, but then also assist our allies and partners in Lebanon. But that was going in, thinking the status quo, just, hey, this is normal, steady state. Lebanon would look very different right now had we not taken those actions and try to think differently and identify a need that was presented across all lines.
Thank you. General?
That's hard to top. You know, one of the proudest moments in my life was when I was the U.S. Ambassador for Counterterrorism. And on 9/11, my small organization was responsible for leading the State Department task force that began responding to, at least from a foreign policy perspective, to what had happened on 9/11. And I'll never forget, I think I had 10 college interns as a part of my staff. And these are kids from Georgetown, American, George Washington, mostly D.C. schools. But as the ambassador for counterterrorism, it was my responsibility to organize a task force to respond to these thousands of requests for support from across the world, from the embassies and so forth and so on. There were other Foreign Service officers. But I was never more proud of my interns who I put to work, working 8-hour shifts in the ops center, working with senior Foreign Service people, working with our embassies across the globe to help the department respond. And Secretary Powell, after things had calmed down, he had a thank you for all the staff. And my special assistant, who is now a Foreign Service officer, who actually is running the Israeli desk, was honored by him as one of the unsung heroes of the department's response. And what felt so good was that these just young kids who were thrown into the fight, and they never wavered. They produced extraordinary work, and many of them today are in the national security space, working in the intelligence community, in the State Department, in the military. Never more proud of putting them into the breach and watching them perform. And to me, you'd ask an earlier question, it's really about mentoring. It's about what leaders have to do to build the next generation. And that was probably my proudest hour of a very long career.
That's beautiful, honestly. And before we move into our segment on representation, I understand that you, Ambassador Bernicat, and my co-moderator actually share a history. If you would like to elaborate, Jace.
Yes, when when we first met at in Network's launch event, you pleasantly surprised me and my mom by speaking to us in our mother tongue, which is Hindi. So I wanted to ask you a bit about your language journey. Could you tell us about what it was like learning Hindi, Bengali, and Russian, and how you went about doing that?
Chase, I have to confess to you something. And I gave you almost all the Hindi I could remember, for one. But I want to go back a little bit because I took French in high school, 3 years. I don't think I had heard another language until I was 13 or 14 years old. I am not a good language learner, I will confess. When I realized I really couldn't go on to French 4, I took Russian, and you would say, well, that doesn't make any sense, except that my sister was in her 3rd year of Russian, and my brother and I were in the same class, so we had a study group, and studying your second foreign language comes a bit easier than the first. Long story short, fast forward to joining the Foreign Service. I took Russian in graduate school. I had the strongest Russian of anyone in my entry-level class. Moscow was on our bid list, and they sent me to Mali, which is in Francophone West Africa. And while I was excited to go to Africa, my very first thought, because they read out your assignment, your first assignment aloud in front of all your colleagues. It's your first test as a diplomat. I remember my first thought was, oh no, French. It's like I had thought I'd escaped it and I had to go back to it. It did not dawn on me truly until that moment that part of this career would be to have to learn to work in another language. And fortunately, they sent me to school. The State Department has a Foreign Service Institute. In 6 months, they turned me into a functionally fluent speaker. And being assigned to Sub-Saharan Africa helped. I was struggling through a conversation with a counterpart one day, and he finally tapped me on the arm and he said, "That's okay, mademoiselle." He said, "It's not our language either, just slow down," which was very helpful. Then I went to France and then and sort of cemented it. And I married a Frenchman, which really helped cement it. Fast forward, when I was assigned to Delhi, it was through 9 months of Hindi. And my Hindi was very good at the beginning of my tour, but people would say, "Oh, that is so wonderful, you speak Hindi." And then they'd switch to English. Whereas my husband, who didn't study it formally, but who does have a real ear for language, would hang out at the markets all day and go to Hindi movies. And to this day, he still works completely in Hindi. The Russian got lost. I had the chance to use it once, and the guard at the foreign ministry in Moscow looked at me like I was speaking Spanish. I switched to French. He didn't like that either. I finally spoke English, and he said, fine. So I would say this. Learning another language is not about getting everything grammatically perfect. One, how each culture constructs its language tells you a lot about how people think. And so the real trick and value in learning a language is in getting that back story, that back information. Secondly, you learn pretty quickly that you're not going to be you're not going to be more than functionally fluent unless you're really gifted. Most of us learn that in addition to what people say, most of how humans communicate with each other is through our nonverbal communications. And when you're thrown into an environment where you do not understand every word or every grammatical construction, you finally realize and appreciate the nonverbal communication that goes on. So I would say I've been lucky. I have colleagues who speak 6, 7, 8 languages all fluently. I speak English and French functionally, and it has worked. So.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. People often don't realize just how useful it is to know another language, not only because you can communicate across borders, but it seems like you can establish a deeper personal connection. And working in foreign policy and national security, I think that's essential.
Well, not only that, and I won't tell the story, but I once translated for Michael Jackson. So, yeah. He didn't know any better, so it worked fine.
That's quite an act to follow. But unfortunately, you all will have to follow that. Because this next question broadens it out to your general cultural experiences. When you're becoming acclimated to a new environment, what were some of the struggles that you faced, the biggest cultural shocks? And following that, what were some of the obstacles that you faced as Black professionals in national security, and how did you navigate them? So starting with you, General.
Well, true fact that I almost didn't get my first job in the counterintelligence division of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations because no African American had ever been assigned permanently. This was in 1970. But they were heroes in our organization who didn't tell the front office that Francis X. Taylor, a graduate of Notre Dame, happened to be an African American. I got the job, and 26 years later, I became the commander of the outfit. So that's the world we grew up in. And there were obstacles to people who look like me moving into jobs like that. But once you're in, you're in. And now it's time to act, which I guess I did pretty well at over the course of a 30-year career. But I tell that story not to say my organization was bad. It was just the way it was until someone had the courage to change and to give someone else an opportunity to demonstrate what they could do. And 26 years later, the organization that almost denied me my first assignment pinned me as the commander. And that's a great American story because it's about organizations changing. It's about acceptance of people who don't look like you. It's about mentoring and all those other sorts of things. And much as the colonel said earlier, when I think I was a major, and one of my superiors, you could be the commander of this outfit. I said, what? I hadn't even thought about it, but through that mentoring over time, that came to fruition.
And for you, Colonel?
So challenges walking in the door. I'm a kid from Englewood, New Jersey. Didn't have much of a background with the military. My father served during Korea, but never really talked about it. So understanding what the military culture was like, entering into the Army was something foreign to me. It's something I knew I always wanted to do. I was an impressionable young kid, a kid of the 70s and 80s. What was the 70s synonymous with? Great TV and B movies. And I was into that, the Rambos and A Bridge Too Far, and I was kind of sold on that as an impressionable youth growing up. But that was in my head as what the military was like, what the Army was like. Not so. But walking in the door in the 82nd Airborne Division as a second lieutenant, not a lot of folks looked like me. And it was not a lack of mentorship, but hey, how do I make the adjustment? What are my colleagues doing? What are my peers doing? What are my superiors doing? What are the expectations? I never forget when I showed up. My company commander and the other three platoon leaders who had already been there for a while. I'm the brand new lieutenant coming in. Hey, we're going on a PT run, physical training run. We're running 10 miles. And unbeknownst to me, that was this is your welcome. Can you make this 10-mile run? And I did. And I think I ran the fastest, or probably I averaged 6 minute and 30-minute miles for that entire 10 miles. But I never got further than one arm length from my company commander, who was out front. And that was that rite of passage. And not a word was said after that. And it was, hey, welcome to the 82nd. And that's kind of how I started my career. But as I progressed, finding a mentor, it doesn't matter who they look like, who they are. It's finding a mentor that has your personal and professional interests in mind, that will kind of, what's the Mandalorian, talking to the younger generation, show me the way. This is the way, right? Someone that's going to show you that way. And then as time progressed, you start seeing others that do look like you, and other mentors that can reach out and assist you, and those people with the same shared experiences. But really, it's finding a mentor, somebody that's going to help you perfect the craft, and then along the way, in turn, you pass that on. You never pass up the opportunity to mentor someone that looks like you or who doesn't. And I'll tell you, based on sheer numbers throughout my career, I have mentored more officers that don't look like me than do. But I will guarantee you 100% of the ones that did look like me, I was able to mentor, or at least make that offer that mentorship, or that hand.
That's amazing. And thank you for that. Ambassador?
A couple of things. I was fortunate enough to meet Ambassador Terrence Todman, who is a storied African-American diplomat. He's passed now. But I'll never forget, he was talking to a group of us one day. And just to give you a setting, when he joined the Foreign Service, there had been no African-American ambassadors who served in countries that were not in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Caribbean. While he was studying for his first language, he was actually denied entry into the cafeteria that the State Department used. And to give you a sense of who he was, he marched straight over to the main State Department and said, "Do you realize this is going on? This is unacceptable. We're here to represent the United States, and we can't get lunch." The main cafeteria at the State Department is now named for Ambassador Todman. But Ambassador Todman said to us, he said, in the end, he said, the State Department is a meritocracy. If you study well, if you learn your craft and you do your job well, you will advance. He said, that's my story. He said, don't let any perceived or real acts of discrimination hold you back. Show people what you can do, and there will be people who seek you out to mentor you, seek you out to do the job. And I found that absolutely to be the case. Being a woman and being a person of color in the diplomatic corps, particularly when I joined in the early '80s, we were still something of an anomaly. 4 years before, in 1977, the State Department stopped essentially running women out of the service who got married. There was an unwritten rule that you could only become a Foreign Service officer as a woman if you were single, because somehow you couldn't possibly balance married life and a career at the same time. I had always heard this was a rule, and the historian told me not too long ago, oh no one ever codified it. If you got married, you just got subpar assignments, you were harassed until you finally got the idea and left. So 4 years later, I entered that culture, as did a lot of women. The State Department worked really hard to bring in underrepresented groups in general. And so I always blanch a little bit when I hear people say, if you can see it, you can be it. It's really true that role models are important. But if I had looked for role models, there were a few women who had survived, almost all of whom were single, by the way, but very few people of color in the service. I came in with a critical mass, so we weren't really mentoring one another. We were scattered around the world. But fast forward to the Obama administration, and I was privileged enough, blessed enough to be part of the single largest group of women ambassadors one year, followed the next year by the single largest number of African American ambassadors that had ever been serving at any one time. Now those numbers dropped off, and so I think the lesson that I tell people is that there is absolutely progress, and that there are really good intentioned individuals. Fortunately, there are oftentimes good intentioned leaders who help push the entire organization, but that you can't wait for or depend on that to happen. There will be those lean years when no one's paying attention or actively working against, and you need to keep your eye on the ball of doing not just a good job, doing the best possible job that you can, so that you're of value to your institution. I'll end with an unexpected experience I had in India, which reminded me about why it's so important that we have as broad a representation as possible, not just in terms of the perspectives we bring, which is really critical if you think about it. How do we look at the world, interpret what's going on in the world, if we don't have the broadest set of perspectives? And I'm not just talking about race and gender. You know, were you the firstborn in your family? Where did you go to college? Where did you grow up? Are you a middle child? Or are you, all of these things shape your perspectives, and we need all of that. But I was at a reception at the defense attaché's house, and I was talking to an Indian guest, and this was in New Delhi, and he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, usually you can tell this is an American accent," but I said, "Guess." He said, "Africa." I said, "Not directly. Guess again." Second guess was the Caribbean, and I said, "No, but you're getting warm." And then I thought, "Oh, do you know that game?" He goes, "Yes." I said, "Guess again." He would not venture a third guess. So I'm from the United States, and he goes, "You don't look American."
Oh.
Now, snarky Marcia would have said, "That's an insult. What do you mean?" Instead, the thought that came to my mind and then actually came out of my mouth was, "You do. Who doesn't look American?" It led to a fascinating discussion afterwards, and I like to think he walked away having a much broader sense of who we are as a nation. But for every time that I doubted myself or I felt someone else was doubting me, that moment was one of the reaffirming experiences that, yeah, I too needed to be out there representing my country.
I think that's a fantastic response to such a question.
Absolutely.
So, General, I wanted to reflect back on your experiences with exclusion, how you almost weren't brought into your career because of your ethnic background. Over the course of your career, what progress have you seen in terms of inclusion within the national security space? And if we could also just touch on racial inclusion, how that has changed.
Well, I think our government over the years has understood the value of inclusion and in bringing Americans of all ilks, shades, colors together to serve our nation. And it's not perfect. I don't think it'll ever be perfect, but we strive to bring forward America's best. And America's best looks like this room. And it's people of color, it's Caucasians, it's Indian Americans, it's Native Americans, it's all that group that makes us who we are. I remember um, the Colonel spoke about some of the war movies. I grew up in the 50s here in D.C., and my idol was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., but I only read about him in Jet. You know, Jet used to do a weekly African American magazine, and they always did something on the armed forces. And I read every one of those articles on the armed forces, and they often described what General Davis was doing. He was a one-star during World War II. Eventually became a 3-star and was eventually promoted to 4 stars. But he was my inspiration. In 1958, I was going to go to West Point, and I was going to be like General Davis. And there was no one going to change my mind, well, except my eyes weren't very good. So I didn't get my appointment to the Naval Academy, and there's another story about how I ended up at Notre Dame. But General Davis, through that period, was my inspiration. And the power of mentoring from afar and the influence that you can have over individuals just by being who you are, working hard, and being an example really is something I think that propels a lot of people to think about being something that they never would have thought of being. And I was 8 years old, and I said, I'm going to join the military, and I'm going to be a military officer like General Davis. And I did it.
I love this. And this question is directed towards you, Ambassador, but I would also like to get input from you, Colonel, as well as you, General. So, America has prided itself, like you said, on building upon these different cultures and drawing from these different inspirations. However, a growing fear among the populace is that 4 years from now, we may not see anyone who looks like us holding positions of leadership in government. So, while it appears that so much progress is being undercut, how can we work around these new obstacles being placed in front of us, Ambassador?
I was talking to a group of students at Yale earlier today about this, among other issues. We were talking more broadly in terms of as hiring slows down, well, there's a hiring freeze at the moment, what can people looking to go into international or intelligence or military is not affected, thank goodness. But my point was that there is a lot of experience to be gained. I began my professional career actually working in the private sector for Procter & Gamble, and the lessons that I learned about leadership and management and resourcing issues were invaluable to me. I would have never thought there would be a transference of those skills. And so I would say two things. One is, if your goal is to work in one of these fields, there are many different ways to get there, and to think about the various different opportunities that are out there that you can take advantage of. I'm not as pessimistic as your question would imply, Dahlia, that we are not, that we won't find anyone in the field. I think, if you look over the course of my career of 40 years, we've had, as I mentioned, larger numbers and smaller numbers. I do think we've passed the point where everyone is excluded. I know there are people out there thinking otherwise, but I don't think we're going to see that. hiring will be less robust. And for people who don't understand what diversity hiring was meant to do, I always put it this way, that we cast an exceedingly wide net at the State Department over the last 3 years. We went into communities and into junior colleges and to parts of the country that we hadn't sent recruiters for. Why? Because of the tyranny of numbers. I wanted to gather as large a number of potential recruits as possible. We were recruiting based on diversity. Again, urban areas, rural areas, all kinds of backgrounds. But we never compromised on the standards that we use to select people. The tyranny of numbers dictated that the more diverse my applicant pool, the more diverse the best of those applicants would be. And that's what has happened. I've spent a lot of time, and I'm still mentoring, urging people to stay the course, even if we are entering into challenging times. Again, remembering Ambassador Todman, I invoke his experience a lot, until we can get back to a period where there is more purposeful, more open recruitment going on. But I don't think we're going to see a disappearance, if you will, because again, there are people serving and serving well.
Thank you, Ambassador. Colonel?
You know, character matters. Don't be denied. And you've got to want to do the work. Okay. And I say those things because character matters, right? How you show up every day and what you do, who you are matters. Don't be denied. Whatever your career field is, know what those opportunities are. And if it's something that you want to go after that. Inquire about it. And you've got to want to do the work. And really, that's where it starts. So I graduated from North Carolina A&T, the largest HBCU in the nation. This for my Hampton brothers and sisters out there, by the way. So gotta get those digs in when I can. But no, it's all good. But hey, as an example, I was a career special forces officer in the U.S. Army, and I would love nothing more to see more African American special forces officers out there. In my year group, I could tell you there were probably about 6 06s at the time. 2 of us are sitting in the room right now. And that was after about 20 plus years, 25 plus years of service. But over my career, ever since I had donned my green beret, I would go back to North Carolina A&T, talk to my former ROTC classmates or the classmates coming through, and I would try to do my best inspirational sales pitch, come into Army Special Forces, look at me, it doesn't take a Superman, I'm not a Superman, you can do it too. I commissioned in 1991. There has not been another Special Forces officer since I got commissioned. Okay. So when you look at the open end of the funnel, right, the big open end where you pour all the major ingredients in there, we've got to fill it. Okay, we've got to get enough representation there. So at the small end of the spigot, right, then we do start showing up. Okay, but you got to want to do the work. You got to want to start.
Absolutely agreed. And for you, General?
Again, that's a hard act to follow. Look, I think it's our job to press all Americans to work hard, to aspire to dream about their passion, and to go after that passion. And just like my story in 1958, reading Jet saying, I'm going to be General Davis. When I was growing up in Southeast D.C. with a single mother who was a GS5 and my brother and sister, that wasn't quite what, I guess society expected for us to come out as over time. But it happened. It happened with strong family, not only my mother, who was a single mother, but her brothers and sisters who were mentors. So the strength of family, the strength of commitment, and the strength of believing in yourself. There are times in a career when you kind of wonder, boy, should I be doing this? And then all of a sudden you kick yourself and said, yeah, this is what I wanted to do. This is tough, but I'm going to do it because this is what I'm passionate about. And I think if we can encourage people of all ilks in America to be passionate about these national security roles, we'll keep the ranks full because people will want to do this work. I worked for 8.5 years at GE as their chief security officer. I worked for almost 45 years in the government. There was never a time when I was in the government that I didn't come home in the evening feeling pride of having served this nation. GE's a great company, but it ain't like serving this nation. And that passion is what has driven me over these many years, and hopefully will drive the next generation of young Americans to want to continue to serve. I'm troubled at times by this notion that government service is somehow not honorable. It is the most honorable profession in our country because you're serving a constitution and a way of life, and there's no other institution that does that than our government and our military service and intelligence services. So I'm optimistic. It won't be easy, but we got to keep the funnel open and tell people that they can be successful doing this kind of work going forward.
I love to hear the optimism from all of you, and I hope that quells some of our fears. Colonel, I'd like to turn to you for this question. We've talked a bit about young professionals who are in this field but come from diverse backgrounds or from non-traditional backgrounds. They might feel like outsiders. So what practical steps can they take to find their footing?
Thank you for that. Again, back to my own experience. Kid from Englewood, New Jersey, no real background in national security or the military. I had to do all that I could to educate myself on getting as much knowledge as I could prior to entering into my chosen profession, my field. Once I'm there, once I walk in, and my advice to anyone coming in that's not steeped in that background is look across your peers. Again, going back to a mentor, someone doesn't necessarily have to look like you, but find that person that has your personal and professional interests in mind. Join whatever that professional organization is that represents your field. Organizations that are out there. I was a member of the Rocks as a young officer that provided mentorship for young military officers that didn't know how to properly navigate through all the other nuance that was involved in a military career or otherwise. Professional organizations, and go outside your comfort zone. Go outside of your comfort zone. Know your peers and colleagues that are different from you. Learn from them. I think back to Nathaniel Greene, the Revolutionary War hero that, wasn't the smartest, wasn't the fastest, wasn't the strongest, but he was full of industry, meaning he observed, worked hard, and was adaptable. Okay, and then that gets you to a certain point. I'm pretty sure like the audience here and a lot of others coming along are much more smarter than I am when I started out. But that's where that industry comes in, where you're lacking in certain ways. You look out across your peers, your colleagues, your mentors, and you try to balance your strengths with your weaknesses.
Thank you, Colonel. This next question is for all of you. So, what skills from your background in diplomacy, intelligence, or military service do you think are most valuable in today's interconnected world? Ambassador, maybe we start with you.
All righty. Um, my colleagues have talked a lot about building consensus. And I think, if you look around at the world today, Secretary Kerry talked about the challenges of climate and environment as being problems without passports or without borders. And so many of the challenges that our nation faces more than ever, I don't think it was ever not true, but more than ever, no one nation can solve the most serious problems before us. And the ability to be able to talk with people you disagree with. Pete Seeger, the American folk singer, said that it was very important to learn to do that. And I think in diplomacy, you're doing that constantly, right? Yes, we speak with like-minded colleagues and nations all the time, but the real challenge comes when we have to go to a country, we have to go to an individual and ask them to do something which is not inherently in their interest, but it is in the interest of the United States. And so we have to convince them that they need to do that. There's a real art to doing that. It's not deception. There's some, quirky definitions about diplomacy out there that I don't like. If you're doing it well, you find a way to explain to that person what element of their interests are included in what you're asking them to do so that they decide to do it, not because you've bullied them into it, not because you've bought them into it, but because you have found that mutual need that will be met for both sides by doing that. I worry, I'm an optimist by nature, but I worry that the polarization we're seeing, not just in our country, but in the world today, is very dangerous because you can needle at our differences and those differences grow, but they grow quickly out of proportion. When you talk to people you disagree with, if you really talk with them, which means you listen to what they have to say, you will find kernels of things that you believe in what they believe. And I think by and large, and I've lived in a variety of countries in a variety of different political situations or systems, and I can tell you, we have more in common as human beings than what divides us, unless we let what divides us take over the narrative. And so for me, that art of talking and figuring out and listening so that you find what is mutually agreeable, what is the least difficult to agree with, everything along that spectrum is a skill we need more of in the world today.
Thank you. General?
I was just listening to the ambassador's comments, and I was thinking, I went to Notre Dame. You had to take 4 years of philosophy and theology, Catholic university. Turned out pretty well. But I was a sophomore, and I took an ethics course. And the ethics, the course was the philosophy of man. We read the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. And one story that has stuck with me for 50 years was Aristotle's description of the contemplative life. And essentially he says, you can gain happiness through contemplation, through learning. And that's been my hallmark my entire career is, what can I learn? What can I see here that I didn't know before that I can make a part of my repertoire? And it has served me so very well, both in the military, in the State Department, in GE, and that is learning your environment, talking to people that don't look like you or think like you do to better understand who they are and why they think that way, and adjust as needed to be a better listener to what people are telling you, has really served me in my career. And it's sophomore, 19 years old, read this 50 years ago, and it's still with me. But I ascribe to the contemplative life, to the learning life, to achieving happiness through knowledge and wisdom. And I encourage you to read Aristotle's piece in the Ethics. It's pretty thick, but in terms of developing a philosophy around this learning behavior, that's, I think, so very important going forward.
The contemplative life, I like that a lot. Colonel?
Yeah, I would say, be well read, much to the general's point. Not just understanding your craft, but the context within which you operate. Okay, so if you're given a regional focus, a global focus, know what that is. Know how to put things into context. Reach out to others, again, to supplement your knowledge. As a leader, leading others from various backgrounds, you have to demonstrate a genuine concern for those individuals. Not the contemplative life or anything, but I have a friend that wrote a book, Deirdre Windsor, Leadership at Hello. And not as thick, but very, very, very thin. But in that, it talks about, noticing people, okay, people in your charge, people that you work around, other teammates, by just saying hello, getting to know them, and genuinely, not just walking by, hey, what's going on, how you doing? And before they give you a response after you ask the question, how are you doing, you're down the hallway. But actually standing there, listening, how are you doing? And having that exchange, genuinely get to know your peers, your colleagues, your superiors, right? And those under your charge. But really, it's about knowing your craft, putting things into context, and knowing the people around you.
Thank you.
Now, throughout this discussion, the three of you have given heavy emphasis on mentorship and its importance. So, starting with you, Brigadier, I would like to ask, what role does mentorship play in increasing representation in foreign policy and security fields? And moreover, how can aspiring professionals seek out those strong mentors?
Well, I think mentorship is a key aspect of leadership. And mentoring, to me, is not just what you look like or where you come from. It's, the first general order is take charge of everything that you're responsible for, to include the people, right? And during my time, the Air Force began to allow women in. They got rid of the Women's Air Force, and women were integrated. And my wife's a retired colonel. That was a tough time. And the idea that all of those people required mentoring to get through the circumstances that they were experiencing so that they got better, and then took care of the people that were coming behind them. I'm still mentoring colonels who were lieutenants when I was a one-star, who are coming to me for advice as they transition from the military into the private sector. And to me, it's what you do. It's kind of how leaders lead. It's how you develop the next generation and how you pay it forward, so that they pay it back to the young men and women that they were privileged to lead. So it's a core leadership strength, and it doesn't matter what you look like or they look like. If they're part of your unit, they're yours, and it's your responsibility to take care of them. One vignette, there's a young man. He probably won't be listening, so but he was a really tough airman, basic, and I had to take him to the woodshed a couple of times, nicely, but he retired as Chief Master Sergeant. One of the best enlisted leaders I've ever met. But he was a knucklehead when he started, and it was my job as a squadron commander to make sure that knuckleheadness did not get in the way of the his opportunities to excel. And I think that's what leaders do. That's why we exist. That's what we're there for, is to perpetuate the leadership going forward and to build the next generation and the next generation, regardless of what they look like or where they came from or what their gender is. If they're part of the institution, we want to make sure that they are sustained in the institution.
And Ambassador, just a brief comment on that.
I would just really double down on the notion that two things. One is you probably need a series of mentors during the course of your career. I think some people think they have to find the perfect mentor or be assigned a perfect mentor and that person will be their guide. Sometimes that's the case, and I have a mentor like that who I reach out to still all the time. But I think it's also important to look around who's doing something well, who's doing something or achieving something that you want to learn how to do. It's fine to have one conversation with that person and gain a better understanding of what they're doing. That too is mentoring. It isn't only about a relationship. But the mentoring requirements or responsibilities of a leader are really important. And we find that oftentimes people will not be willing. I don't think this is as true in the military as it is at the State Department, where people are more than willing as as part of their mentoring duties to tell you when you're doing something well, but to be more reluctant about telling you when you're being a knucklehead or when you've just done something that isn't particularly good. And I always urge the people that I mentor, particularly if they are mentoring others, have honest conversations with people. You're not sparing them by avoiding that conversation. Otherwise, they'll keep doing the wrong thing. So, I think there needs to be an element of remembering that feedback, good, honest feedback, is actually a kindness.
And for you, Colonel?
Yeah, it's about building relationships, right? So, mentoring is critical, and mentoring and being mentored. It's about building relationships. You've got to identify those that have, again, your personal and professional interests in mind, but consider the other side of that too. When you're mentoring, availability, and do you make yourself accessible? Do you make yourself available to mentor that next generation? And I would say, don't be so quick to put a label on it either. Oh, I've got to find a mentor, or the big M word, mentor this. I mean, it's a relationship at the end of the day. Okay, it's something where you can garner more professional expertise, somebody that has blazed the path where you want to go, someone that you can learn from. But you establish that by building those relationships.
We're talking about mentorship and future leaders, and the world that our future leaders are coming into is becoming increasingly more complex. Issues like AI, cyber threats, new geopolitical shifts. So I'd like to ask you, Colonel, how should these future leaders prepare themselves to address these new issues?
Yeah, and I hate to keep repeating myself. If I do, I apologize. But it's being well read. I mean, you would ask me 10, 15 years ago, I would think AI would be somebody's initials, right? What is this AI you speak of? But you have to be well read. You have to be a quick read in this environment now to be able to keep up with just the technology alone. But then not just knowing about the technology, but how do you apply it to what you're doing, to your profession? And then again, going back to context. Again, when I was in Lebanon, and I was fresh from the National War College right down the street at Fort McNair, and at that senior in my career, I'd learned some fancy new terms, global context, regional context, whatever the term du jour was. And I remember sitting there with the ambassador and the country team meeting, and we were talking about this threat of incursion across the border with ISIS and with Hezbollah there and the entire region. And I threw out, not just the terms, but I understood them, but global context. And oh yeah, if we do this or the embassy does this, What's the regional impacts? And then what is the country, what is Syria going to do? What is Israel to our south going to do? But being able to put all those pieces together, you have to be well-read. You have to understand that. You have to understand the historical background and the context to be able to talk smartly about that. And that, again, builds to your credibility, okay? And it all ties together. So when we talk about mentoring, when someone hears you articulate those terms, you have a deep understanding, a rich understanding of how it applies. They're willing to invest in you, and others are willing to invest in you, and they seek you out for your knowledge. And that doesn't happen in a week, in a month. That's built over time. And we talk about earlier, where are these future leaders coming from? That's where it starts. You build that base of credibility, you build those relationships, you build that trust and consensus. You're a master of your craft. And as you graduate to these various levels, you're being sought out now for your knowledge, expertise, and leadership.
Now, General Taylor, as someone familiar with positions in diplomacy, intelligence, and the military, could you tell us how the skills of each of those intersect?
They all come together. I mean, leadership is leadership. I remember when General Powell turned me down the first time as ambassador for counterterrorism because he didn't want the State Department to think that he was bringing the Pentagon over to the State Department. There are actually only two general officers that came with General Powell when he was Secretary of State, General Williams, who ran our building office, and me. And he said, I just want to make sure the State Department doesn't think I'm going to stack all these military guys and turn the State Department into the military. But the skill set that I brought was very useful as U.S. Ambassador for Counterterrorism, as the head of diplomatic security. It's about leadership. It's about organization. It's about executing the mission. And to me, that's the consistency across all of these areas. It's about how well you organize and execute the mission is going to be how you're judged in terms of your effectiveness.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, we're going to pivot now to the audience questions.
If you have any questions, please join us at the microphone.
Good evening to our panelists. My name is Kevin Russell. Thank you for a wonderful discussion so far. I think we've all been enlightened by your words and your thoughts on a number of topics. One thing I think is important now in our time, particularly for this crowd, for our young folks here, is what advice or what things would you pass on to them in the time that we're in now, and how do they see themselves progress from this point on, and kind of really what kind of encouragement or things they need to look out for?
Follow your dream. I remember, was it Michael Jordan? If I could see it, I could do it. Whatever that song was back in the day. But follow your dreams. The opportunities are here. Follow them. Don't let anyone deter you from achieving your dream. And if you work hard enough and you demonstrate excellence, you're going to achieve your dream. 50 years ago when I started, there was rioting in the streets here in D.C. It's pretty ugly, and we got through all that. We'll get through all this with you following your dreams and working hard and achieving those dreams in service to our nation, in service to the business community, wherever you want to plant yourself to do better. But don't be deterred by the environment from seeking to be the best that you can be.
I would add that by following your dream, by doing what you want to do, you'll be passionate about it. And I don't know of any instance where intellect overcomes passion, or where obligation or drive overcome passion. If you're passionate about what you're doing, you will do it well. You'll do it the best you can. The other thing that I always tell people is don't be afraid of pretender syndrome. If you're like me, and every job that I've taken on, I have had a moment where I thought, what was I thinking? I can't do this, or this is going to be a lot harder than I thought. I've learned to trust that feeling. It still overwhelms me at the beginning of a new job, but now I trust that feeling because it's my best indicator that I have now put myself into a position where I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm going to be challenged every time, rather than sitting back on my laurels or resting easily in a place where I know I could do the job without thinking about it. So I urge you, if you get that feeling, it's not really your enemy. It's just telling you you're about to really grow.
And briefly, excuse me, it's you have to ask yourself the question: excuse me, do you genuinely want to be here? Do you genuinely want to do what you're doing? And really, that ties back into, are you pursuing your dream? Are you doing that thing that you want to do? Because over time, if it's forced, if it's contrived, if you feel like you're not there for the right reasons, for your reasons, it'll show. It'll show. And don't be discouraged. Along the way, not every day is going to be great. I usually reflect back in my 30-year Army career. I've had some great days. I've had some hard days. I've never had a bad day. Never had a bad day. Hard days when you have multiple casualties in a combat scenario. Great days when, I consider a great day being cold and wet outside in a field exercise, getting poured on. But the camaraderie and the laughter shared and that limited shared experience you have with only a few others that you can talk about years later, those are great. Hard days, never a bad day. Don't be discouraged.
Let's have this be the last question, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Colonel, General, and Ambassador. You guys are absolutely inspiring, especially for our younger generation here. And I have, you guys are obviously trailblazers as well as, just professionals in your field, so inspiring. I would even say superheroes in a way. So if you could have one superpower in this world, what would it be?
I think we'll start off with you, Ambassador.
I was watching Star Trek last night, so this will probably influence. I would love to be able to teletransport. I love to travel, but my greatest frustration is not being able to do more in more places. And so that would be the superpower I would choose. I could just snap my finger and be somewhere else.
And you, General?
I don't know. The superpower that has propelled me have been the people. To get to know more people. I teach at Notre Dame. I teach at the University of Chicago. I'm continually trying to reach out to young people and older people who are going through their education as well. But the ability to not just inspire, but to give people a view of what they can be, not who they are, but what they could be, is a great superpower. And it's the nature of, I think, leadership is to want to grow the next generation. And I'm already working on my grandchildren. So, but that's a superpower that I think has buoyed me throughout my 50 years of service, is the people that I've touched or who have touched me and made me a better human being and a better leader, just by virtue of having the opportunity to work with them.
And finally, you, Colonel.
I don't think my answer of to leap tall buildings in a single bound would would suffice based on that. But I used to say to be able to see into other people's minds, see what they're thinking, but then that could be a curse. As on the other hand, and I'd like to say to save everyone. I'm somewhat of a radical, and this actually went back to the earlier faux pas. But I was told as a young lieutenant, "Hey, sir, you can't save everyone." And my response has been consistently, "Why not?" And one of my earlier faux pas, when I tried to do that to no avail, it was going in my company commander's office to advocate for a young staff sergeant that had a DUI and just a whole bunch of stuff. And I said, "Sir, I bet my bars Staff Sergeant such and such won't do that again." And not only did he do it again, he did it a second time and a third time. And I think it was the grace of that company commander looking at me and just kind of shaking his head like, "Yeah, that's you're young, you've got time, you're going to learn not to say that again." It's a hard lesson, but yeah, to try to save everyone that could be saved would be a superpower.
A very commendable one indeed.
Jace, I think you have a final comment before I wrap this up.
Yes. Ambassador, General, Colonel, thank you so much for your thoughtful contributions to today's discussion. Really insightful. And audience members, thank you for contributing questions too. We love to hear from you. Throughout this evening's program, our panelists have provided rare and groundbreaking insights into this often discreet field. We hope that their perspectives have not only informed, but also inspired you to consider joining this vital work. I'd like to take a moment now to connect back to In-Network's mission, which in itself is to empower youth and young adults of all backgrounds to pursue careers in national security, foreign policy, international law, and diplomacy, regardless of gender, race, sexuality, financial means, or creed. As our panelists have so powerfully demonstrated, we are all endowed with a voice. You have a voice, I have a voice, and it's up to us to use it. Through our platform called Mighty Networks, you'll gain access to invaluable resources, upcoming seminars, and many future events we have in store. Thank you so much for coming.
That was such an eloquent way to end. And I do want to read a comment that came in from our online audience. What a tremendous discussion. This should be required viewing in every school in the country. So well done. This was just amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.